Alright guys, welcome back to the YouTube channel. Today we're going to show you how to lower an R8 on either coilovers or springs. The first thing you're going to want to do is take off the wheels. If you happen to have stock wheels, you might need to go into the front and get your center cap removal tool in order to reach the lug nuts. I would highly suggest if you have a lift, use that. If not, you should work on either the front two or the rear two wheels at the same time. The front is especially really hard to work on without jacking up both front wheels at the same time. And for the front, you most likely will need another person to help you put in the bottom bolt. So if you don't have a helping hand around, start on the rear and get back to the front later. Once you have the wheels off, we're going to start by removing the front fender liner. The front fender liner uses a T30, and you're going to start removing all the bolts that you see. There's a ton of these bolts, so as you start removing the fender liner, give it a slight tug. If it's still stuck on, that means you're missing a bolt. The fender liner should come off with ease, so don't pull too hard. After the front fender liner is out, you can start working on the top front panel. All you need for the panel is a flathead screwdriver to loosen the screws on top. I think there's 4 or 5. Once you loosen those up, you can just pull the panel right off the top. Technically, this isn't a necessary step, but this made it easier for me to reach my impact driver in to take out the top bolt. So once this top piece is off, here's a quick look at the strut. As you can see, there's one bolt on the bottom, one bolt on the top. The bottom bolt is the hardest one to get in, since most likely you're going to need a pry bar in order to get that bottom bolt to line up. The first thing you're going to want to do is unplug the mag ride sensor. So all you need to do is push this clip up, and then once it's up, you can pull it down a little bit to reach the plug and unplug it. Once this is unplugged, make sure you put this to the side so when you're taking off the front bolt, you don't happen to rip the plug. So all I did here was I put in my ratchet wrench. I believe it's a 18, and I grabbed a wrench on the other side, and I used my a pipe as a breaker bar. All I did was loosen this to get the bolts off. Once I got the bolts off, I then got my impact driver, and with a bunch of extensions, was able to reach the bolt from the top. However, for the meantime, I left this top bolt in while I started working on the bottom. So for the bottom bolt, as you can see here, there's that sway bar right underneath that's attached. So later on, when you put this bolt back in, you're most likely going to have to put a pry bar between that sway bar and your shock in order to pry it back up to get the holes to line back up. Now, I loosened this bottom bolt and I took it out, and sometimes the shock will get stuck in that position just because it's been there a long time. What you could do is, once this bolt is out, you could take a pry bar and stick it right between the shock and that like Y gap right there, and then you can just pry it a little bit, not too hard, and then it'll just pop right out, and then it'll sink down. And then once this is out, you could go back to start removing the top. So as you can see here, the shock wasn't moving, so I just stuck my pry bar in there real quick and popped it right off. And then I'm going back to the top. The video shows me using a ratchet, but this took too long, so I went and grabbed my impact driver and some extensions and was able to gun out the top bolt from the panel that we took off the front earlier. So once I take out this top bolt, the shock is now loose. In order to remove the shock, I had to step down on the disc a little bit in order to lower the control arm so I could pull out the shock. If you are installing coilovers, set your coilovers to the lowest possible setting and reinstall your new coilover. Make sure you skip the next step on installing the springs and go to the part on the reinstallation. Once your shock is out, what you want to do is you want to mark the top and the bottom between the two cups that are holding the spring in place so that you can line it back up later. I basically just drew a line down the whole shock. That way I knew where everything lined back up. Once you do this, you want to put your spring compressor on and start compressing this spring down until you have enough room to place the magnetic ride strut removal tool on your strut. It's basically an aluminum clamp for the strut so you can remove the cap of the strut so you can take off the spring. The name of this tool is the T40177. It cost me around 65 bucks, and I'll put a link in the description to where you can order it. Technically, you don't need this tool. You could use a vice grip or something similar to remove it, but since it was my first time disassembling the shock, I just played it safe and bought the tool. Now, if you're having a hard time putting in the shock removal tool, meaning you don't have enough room to place it in, what you could do is you could unseat the ring at the bottom of the shock and it will lower the base plate of the spring so it'll give you more room up top. Just make sure you mark everything so you could line it back up later. If you scroll forward a few minutes, I have in the video how to take off the lower cup. Compressing the spring takes some time and you want to go back and forth to make sure you are compressing the spring evenly. Once you get enough room to place the magnetic ride removal tool in place, make sure you clean the area of any oil or grease for the clamp. Otherwise, your tool will just spin. You have to clamp this very tightly to the strut because it's going to spin otherwise. Now all you need to do is stick something like a really large screwdriver into the top bolt hole on the strut and just loosen it. It might be a little tight because there's Loctite on the screw, so just take your time and remove it. Make sure while you're spinning the top off, you don't get the magnetic ride plug stuck anywhere. Otherwise, you'll rip the wires and you're going to have to resolder it or buy a new top. Once the cap is removed, you can decompress the spring and take the stock spring off and start working on the bottom spring holder. For this bottom cap, I marked the position before I removed it. First thing I did was I tapped the cup down a few times with my mallet in order to expose the ring. There's a special tool to remove this ring, which I didn't have. All I did was I stuck in some pliers and opened up the ring, and there's a small little gap in the ring where you could stick some pliers in. Once I opened it up a little bit, I had a small flathead screwdriver and just pried it down on the stock shock a little bit. Once you get a little bit on the shock, then you can just get the rest of the ring down. So all you need to do is remove the ring down the shock, and you can move the cup way down to make installing the new spring a lot easier. Now you can start reassembling the new spring onto the shock. With the bottom cup down, it should be easy to put the lower spring and the top cup back on and still have enough space to put the magnetic ride removal clamp back in order to screw the top back on. You will want to clean the threads off of the old Loctite and drop in some new Loctite to keep it secure. Now, after you tighten back up the top, you will want to compress the spring so you can push the bottom cup back into its original position. You are going to want to compress the spring as much as possible to have enough room to reseat the bottom cup, but make sure everything is lined up properly before you decompress the spring. Once everything is lined back up and seated in place, you can decompress the spring and reinstall the shock. Just remember that you want to do each side one at a time so that you don't mix up the shocks and swap the right and left side. First, I put the shock back in by stepping on the disc slightly and lining up the top bolt. I put the top bolt through, but I didn't tighten everything down. Now putting in the bottom bolt for the shock was the most difficult part for me. I think part of the reason was I did not jack up both front wheels, so the sway bar had a lot of extra tension. This is the only part where you need two people. It may be difficult to see, but I had to use a pry bar between the bottom of the shock and one of the rods that connected to the sway bar in order to line up the holes to get the bottom bolt of the shock back on. While I was prying the shock back into place, my mentee student pushed the bolt through. In the picture, you can even see that I added some weights to give more leverage to get the lower control arm down in order to line up the holes. If you can get this part done, this is the hardest part, and everything else is easy. Once you get the bottom bolt in place and tighten everything back up, you can reinstall the fender liner and the top front panel and put the wheel back on, and now you're done with the front. Next, we're going to work on the rear, and the rear is a lot easier. First, like the front, you're going to want to remove the fender liner and tug on it until it comes off. Also, on the bottom of the rear bumper, there's also a couple bolts that are attached to the fender liner, so you're also going to need to remove those as well. Once you have the fender liner off, the procedure is pretty simple. So the air intake has 3 torque bolts that are holding it in. Once you remove these 3 torque bolts, you could take a small flathead screwdriver and pry off the intake. Technically, you don't have to detach the intake, but I found taking off the entire intake was easier to work with. You could first try with leaving it in and see if you can get to the bolts without having to remove it. But if you do remove it, you could just pull out both pieces. It's 2 separate pieces, and you can pull this out entirely and then put it back in later. It took quite a bit of wiggling to get the air intake out, but be rest assured, once you take out those 3 torque bolts, that everything will just snap out and snap back into place later. Now you have access to the top bolt, and you can remove this and then also remove the bottom bolt. And once these 2 are off, then you just need to go back to the earlier steps before in order to compress the spring and reinstall the new lowered spring. Once you have the new lower spring installed, all you need to do next is reinstall the shock. So first thing I did was put in the top bolt, and then I tightened it up a little bit, but not all the way. And then in order to line back out the bottom bolt, all I did was I took a jack and raised up the lower control arm a little bit in order to line up the bottom bolt, and the bottom bolt slid right through. This is way easier than the front, and you only need one person to do this. Once I tightened up the bottom bolt, I then went ahead and reinstalled the air intake. So in order to reinstall the air intake, you're going to want to first push. You can either attach the 2 pieces that you took off together or reinstall one at a time. I would suggest putting the 2 plastic pieces together. Push the air intake that's closer to the door, push that in place first, and then that should snap back into place and you'll know it's in place. And then for the other piece where you had used a small flathead screwdriver to pry off, that one you're going to want to snap back into place. So this is actually a little harder to push back into place. You might want to lube it up a little bit with maybe like a little bit of water or something that will evaporate, or just like anything that you could use to just make it slide in easier. But once you snap it back into place, you'll know that it's in place and it's secure. If it's a little wobbly or wiggly, then you know that it's not in place correctly. So make sure you get that tight before you end up putting everything back together. Once your intake is bolted back in, reinstall the fender, put on the wheel, and drop the car. Here's a video of the car after a few weeks when the springs have settled in. So these are H&R springs. It's a little lower in the rear than the front, but once installed, I think that gives a pretty even look. There's probably about less than a finger gap between the tire and the fender for both front and rear. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please subscribe.